Dear friends, I am David Pearson, and it is my task to welcome you to the Mandem Museum for this discussion entitled Constitutional Reform, Possibilities and Pitfalls. The discussion is being put on by the Caribbean Christian Leadership Network, a group of concerned Christians whose mandate it is to try to bring a lot of these discussional elements into the public forum, and where we'll bring the church and the society together, because we think that these matters are very important for discussion. Constitutional reform is a subject of much debate recently, and this is just one of several fora today discussing the matter. Thankfully, there's a moderator, Mr. Leighton Pusey, who will do the more important thing of introducing the panelists and framing the discussions. But before we do that, I need to let you know that we have Al Jazeera Plus here. They're taping for a 7-minute documentary that they're doing on Jamaica's response to the constitutional reform process. They might be interested in doing some interviews with you at the end. We are not compelling you to participate, but we ask you to be nice and to accommodate them. We're also asking you to turn off your cell phones, not to turn them down, but to turn them off for 2 reasons. It will help to stop the interference, the possible interference in our discussions, as well as to reduce the strain on our center's bandwidth, and so will assist our audience in social media. So I want to say a special welcome to you who are here in the flesh in the center, as well as those who are online. So at this point in time, I want to turn you over to Mr. Leighton Pusey, today's moderator.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's not quite morning here. I don't know where it will be. It's exactly morning, but good afternoon, everyone. As Pastor David Pearson said, you are going to understand as we go along that we have an excess of Davids, so you will forgive me if I get them all confused. As Pastor David Pearson said, we are interested in encouraging discussion, especially among members of the church. One of the things that we found is that our church culture, our church life in Jamaica is so wide and diverse that in many cases we have opposite and different views on many topics, and we don't have the opportunity to share the views and hear others in relation to those views. As part of those discussions, as we've said before, we've had discussions on reparations, on the role of women in church, on governance, and in other areas. As part of those discussions, we felt that it was important for us to deal with the issue of constitutional reform. We are concerned, in particular, that constitutional reform is seen by some to be not important to the common man, that the man who is going to the market in Brownstown doesn't really need to know about constitutional reform. So we have brought 3 persons here who will shed some light on that. We have Mrs. Lalita Davis Mattis, who is an attorney at law. She has worked with NEPA in the environmental space. She has worked with the Jamaica National Heritage Trust, and is now chair of the Reparations Committee. And she is a member of the Constitutional Reform Commission, and we will hear from her. We also have Mr. David Batts. Mr. Batts has been an attorney at law in private practice. He has now gone over into government, and you might see his name in various places, serving the crown in particular ways. Mr. Batts, but importantly, has written a book called The Law and Constitution for Every Jamaican, and is concerned about the Constitution being important to every person, and that's one of the reasons why he's here. We also have Pastor David Henry. As I said, we have many Davids and no Goliaths so far. Pastor David Henry is an attorney also, He was at the Attorney General's Department, spent several years in private practice at Nunes, Cofield, Dillon and Company, and he's now pastor of the Swallowfield Church and is on the Constitutional Law Commission also. So you'll hear from them, you'll have an opportunity to ask them questions, and we will have an opportunity to be involved in so many different ways. We're going to start with firstly before we start, for ease of reference, we have gotten their permission that we can use first names, so it's Lalita, David, Henry, David Batts, Leighton, because if you start to call titles, you know, when you have Pastor, Reverend, Dr. David Henry, it will take you half an hour to get the word out before you can ask any question. So we are doing it in a more informal way. So we're asking David Batts now to come and answer the question, does constitutional reform really matter to the average Jamaican, or is it something that these lawyers really want to do just to use big words and to twist us up in different ways?
Say yes.
Say yes, that's enough. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
I'm extremely honored to be here. The honor is doubly so because Lalita has turned up in purple and white, a color dear to my heart.
Did I show you this as well?
And our other panelist, Pastor, it's a no titles, David Henry, although he may not look it, was once an excellent football player. He was the midfield general when we played at Caville in Barbados, and later for the Norman Mandela Law School. When David left his successful legal practice to go full-time in the ministry, some of us thought he was crazy. Well, he has proved us wrong. I wish to also salute the organizers of this event, not only for having me here, but for reaching out as Christians and their faith and taking it into other areas. You know, a lot of time we criticize the religious for keeping religion in their church. But this effort to reach out to the world, so to speak, I think can only augur well for Jamaica. I would also like to thank my esteemed colleague, Leighton, for his kind words. You know, it has been said that a good introduction makes your mother proud, but surprises your father. Well, both my parents are here, and I was watching their faces closely. It does seem the introduction may have passed that test. But interestingly, and closer to the moot, George and Clover, they got married in 1962, the year we received our new constitution. They have always been committed to Project Independence. They imbued myself and my siblings, there were 5 of us in all, with love for and pride in Jamaica. As children, we were made aware of national symbols, of the need to stand when the national anthem was played. I have fond memories of participation in Independence Day parades in Falmouth, Trelawney, where we spent our early years. Yet, I doubt my parents ever became aware of the content of the new constitution. Neither did I until I embarked on the study of law. This is remarkable. In a society where for 400 years, the vast majority had been effectively excluded from participation in the formal structures of governance, one would have expected a greater emphasis on public education about the Constitution after 1962. You see, societal norms and people's mode of conduct, people's behavior, are as much a cultural manifestation as it is a result of dictate. A law is more likely to be generally obeyed if it accords with values passed from one generation to another. Conversely, if the law runs counter to those values, it is likely not to be willingly obeyed. The value system, or if you will, the culture, is a direct result of the historical experience of the people. This is true at the macro level of the state, but is also true at the micro level of individuals in a family. Therefore, as we discuss constitutional reform, I suggest it is important to bear in mind that cultural dimension. Before I go on, it is a good time to remind you all that I do not speak for the judiciary. I could not do so even if I wanted to. This is because Jamaica has an independent judiciary. Independent means not only that no politician or businessman or anyone else can tell any judge what to do or think, but also that one judge cannot tell another what to do or think. It means also that we ought not to circumscribe our freedom to decide issues one way or the other. The Chief Justice is first among equals, and the principle also applies to the holder of that office. So today, I can only give my views. However, I must exercise my independence responsibly. Judges ought not to prejudge cases or express opinions on issues that may possibly come before them. Therefore, I will not be didactic in the views I express, and I will endeavor not to make value judgments. I may share ideas and suggest possible approaches, but hopefully will not cross an unwritten line. The Constitution, to get back to the theme, has mechanisms to protect your judge's independence. And in this process of reform, hopefully, nothing will be done to put the independence of the judiciary in jeopardy. In this regard, let me suggest that the process of constitutional reform may be as important as the changes that may be made to the Constitution. What do I mean? Well, consider, judging by the voter turnout in recent elections, public interest in public affairs seems to be in decline. And this may be why the moderator asked me that question. My own unscientific observations suggest that many people are skeptical about constitutional reform and regard it as something for the big man or somebody else. The disinterest may have many causes. People could be turned off by the nature of our politics and its associations, particularly persons old enough to recall the conflicts of the 70s. It may also be the lack of a direct correlation between constitutional reform and economic benefits. After all, most of us are more concerned with making a living. And there may be other reasons. I suggest, however, that public interest or disinterest, if you will, may be in part cultural. Culture I use in its broadest possible sense. It implies behavior or norms passed on from one generation to another, and therefore is directly linked to our history and experience. Let us not forget that in the 400 years of colonization, approximately half of which the majority in this country were enslaved, the authorities executed policies designed to exclude the majority from participation in the affairs of state. Control over the majority was maintained by the dual techniques of brute force on the one hand and miseducation or non-education on the other. It was for a long time the policy of the colonial state not to educate most Jamaicans. Later, when education was provided, it was largely elementary and designed to sustain the plantation economy. Therefore, for example, no universities were built. Notwithstanding some amelioration of that situation in the later colonial period, it has been estimated that in 1962, as many as 40% of Jamaicans were illiterate. All this, I think, has had a profound impact on our efforts to build a nation. In 1962, regrettably, as I have said earlier, not much of an effort was made to involve the people of Jamaica in the process of constitutional creation. There was no National Assembly called. There was insufficient time, something like 6 weeks, allotted for public input. The document was not even put to the people for a vote by way of a referendum. The new constitution was drafted by delegates appointed by the two political parties, then taken to England, where with adjustments it was passed into law. The Constitution of Jamaica is therefore a schedule to an act of the UK Parliament. Not surprisingly, most Jamaicans have internalized neither its content nor the value system it represents. In the 60 years since independence, not enough was done to educate Jamaicans in school, at the workplace, or even in Jamal classes about their constitution. Now, 61 years later, we have an opportunity to correct past errors. This time around, the process can involve genuine public education about the Constitution. What is it? What purpose does it serve? What it contains, as well as the rights and responsibilities of citizens. Jamaicans should then be better able to decide whether to change and what to change and how to change. Participation in the process of constitutional change is likely to be increased as a result of this. Public participation may also be encouraged if the proposed changes relate or are related to the daily lives of Jamaicans. Jamaicans may, for example, consider that the replacement of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council with the Caribbean Court of Justice should accompany the removal of the King of England as head of state. They may come to this appreciation because the Privy Council is an advisory body to the King. So why keep the advisory body to the King as a court? They may ask themselves. An appreciation of the relative costs and accessibility of each course should also resonate with our population. Jamaicans may consider that corruption being the problem it is, and the drain on the national budget it represents, that anti-corruption agencies should be strengthened. This may be done by placing in the constitutional entrenchment provisions similar to those which protect the judges. In this way, the Integrity Commission, INDICOM, the Office of the Public Defender, would do their jobs without the possibility of victimization. The people of Jamaica may consider that the head of the executive, rather than being selected from among the members of Parliament, should be directly elected by the people of Jamaica. They may believe that he should be able to select the ministers in his cabinet from among persons outside of Parliament. In this way, their MPs can focus more time on holding the executive to account and advocating for their constituents. The electorate may consider that appointments to statutory boards and executive agents are best done after a process involving examination of nominees by the people's elected representatives. This can be a hedge against inappropriate or unqualified appointments. The creation of a process by which incompetent persons may be impeached by the electorate is another change to the Constitution which may resonate. To this list of possible changes, which relate to our people's daily existence, I add the protection of the environment, a change designed to enhance the individual's access to an effective remedy when such rights are breached, is likely to attract public participation and support. These few ideas, and I'm sure there are many more, demonstrate constitutional change which will be of interest or may be of interest to our people. A process of consultation which lets people know their voice will be heard that their opinions matter and the way proposed change will impact their daily lives should increase public interest and participation. I suggest that at the end of that process, and after a plebiscite is held, the Constitution should be a document made by Jamaicans, in Jamaica, which Jamaicans truly own and understand. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batts. I've known David Batts for a long time, and that's the briefest I think he has been. So we need to be very happy about that. I think that there are a lot of questions, I think, which came out of that, and that's things for discussion. So please make a note of them as we go along. We are going to try to be on time and to be efficient in relation to time. I want to say one thing, however, which is out of this process, one thing which may need to happen is that many of us, I mean, I say us, I include myself, who have not been engaging with the electoral system. There are several of us who are not even enumerated because, for various reasons. But it means then that persons who see this cause and see that this is important would have to become enumerated if we are going to be part of this process. So it is wonderful, and we Jamaicans are excellent at it, to stay back and criticize all of them, because all of them do it wrong. But we need to be in a position in terms of these things to be able to actually do something. I want to now invite Lalita to come and speak to us about the progress and other areas in terms of where we are so far in the process.
Thank you so much. And I echo the sentiments of David that it is really a pleasure to be here. So the committee was formed earlier this year. And there has been much ado, much debate about many things, the composition of the committee, its work, whether or not it's shrouded in secrecy, whether or not we're engaging in nefarious activities, whether or not the ministers are going to be out, so whether or not the committee is properly constituted, most of us being lawyers, etc. So we have come a long way since March, and my task this afternoon is to just give you a brief overview of what the work has been. So the process is basically dubbed many things: the Jamaicanization of the Constitution, the reformation of the Constitution, etc., making the people sovereign. All these terms are being utilized within the context of the committee, as well as the context of the population in terms of what's going on and what does this mean. David mentioned what we call the man in the street. In other words, what's in there for him. A lady asked us this week, is it going to affect her UK pension? You know, people ask, is it going to affect trade? Am I going to need a visa where I don't need a visa? Am I going to not have a visa, etc.? So let us start with the nucleus of the discussion. So we are a sovereign nation. We are celebrating independence. Today is Emancipation Day. And at Emancipation, we know what happened, and at Independence, we also know what happened. We never, ever enjoyed independence as a people. So I think one of the views of not just this government, but the previous governments in terms of even the constitutional reform committees that were engaged before, is really just to look at where do we see our own constitution. And David did mention the hierarchy of where our constitution really is one of the lowest forms of the legislative hierarchy. It's an ordering council, is attached to something. So then we also use terms such as repatriating the constitution, meaning bringing it back here so that it can be passed by the Parliament of Jamaica, passed by the people of Jamaica. So again, let's speak to the nucleus of this. So we have a king of Jamaica, and many people don't consider King Charles to be the king of Jamaica. And he is the king of Jamaica. And I want to, this is just maybe a little comic relief. We were at a public consultation, and a lady took the podium, she took the microphone, and she said, you know, there are so many other things to do in this country. She said, look how many poor people are here. They want to, we should focus on other things rather than this. And then when she learned that King Charles was really the king of Jamaica in terms of head of state, you know, she came back and she said, but what if he dies and the wife has any role to play? Then she says, okay, we should really go for the king. So in other words, but people do have different views about this process. So to dispense with King Charles III, King of Jamaica, the Constitution, of course, prescribes the methodology. So there's no way around that. And the Constitution prescribes how it works. In other words, you must have the consultation, there must be a bill, it must go to the public, it must go to the two houses in Parliament, and eventually it must go to the people. So nothing can happen unless it goes to the people. There must be a referendum. And so people must go to the polls, people have to be enumerated, and people have to vote whether or not they want to keep King Charles, King of Jamaica, or whether or not we want to move on. No. Even in moving on, people are asking, okay, then, so what? What happens after that? What next after we do that? And so the minister did announce a series of activities. In other words, the process is three-phased. And the first phase has to do with the more difficult parts of the Constitution that need reformation. And one of them, of course, if we want to go republic, then it means that we have to dispense with King Charles being King of Jamaica as the first step. So the discussions in the council, in the committee, have to do with, so what is now going to be the role of this new president? And what is going to be the role of the Prime Minister? We have been having consultations, submissions are being made to the council, and people have a variety of views. Some persons ask, why do you need both? Why do you need a president and a prime minister? Some people say they want an executive president like the United States of America. Some people have made recommendations that are far left. Sometimes, so therefore our response would be ensure, at least personally for me, my view is whatever formulation we decide on, it must transcend generations and it must work regardless of who assumes the position. Because we are not creating a mechanism, we're not creating a governance framework or legislative framework that is pliable. It has to be secured for future generations. In fact, the issue of intergenerational equity in terms of generations to come, we are really the trustees here trying to have these discussions. And there are discussions about whether or not young people are interested, what is in it for them, they're on their happy way. It forms part of the whole reparatory justice movement as well as part of our own internal reparatory justice initiatives, because we now need to have our own constitution. We have been discussing the issue of the education of our people, and as David said, who knows anything about the Constitution? Even on the committee, most of us are lawyers, we're learning ourselves, because we really are not constitutional experts, so to speak. So we have our experts, of course, on the committee. We have, for example, Dr. Lord Barnett, etc. And we have the committee, I think, is well represented, and I also think that, and I'm going to say this, I ask myself the question sometimes, who knows people's business and problems more than lawyers and pastors? I'll just leave it at that. In terms of the public education program, right, in terms of the public education program, we are going island-wide, we are going parish by parish, we are doing parish meetings, and we are also meeting with specific groups. For example, we'll meet with the Justice of the Peace, we meet with community groups, people have questions to ask, people want to know, so what of the JP, what's going to become of the JP? If you get rid of the king, what's going to happen to the custos, what's going to happen to all these other bodies? And of course the answer is, justice of the peace are necessary for the effective function of the country. So whatever it is that we're going to call them, they will remain. In terms of the value system, David also mentioned the value systems, and I think that this is a process by which we should determine what is it that we want Jamaica to look like. What do we want to see for ourselves? So we can always say, let's do it like the US. We need to ask ourselves, are we politically mature enough to do certain things? You know, what are the driving forces? Should we stand back and say, okay, there are all these examples from various jurisdictions, but what is it that we want for Jamaica? We have also said in the committee that some of the elements of the Constitution have served us well, have served this democratic process well. People say throw it out. One man said, basically just burn it. We said, no, you can't burn it because the provisions in the Constitution say you can't burn it. You can't get rid of it because there's a prescription as to how you effect the various changes. These are some of the issues. One of the other issues that we have been discussing is the role of the Member of Parliament. There are Jamaicans who believe that the Member of Parliament should not have a ministerial role because you voted him in to take care of the constituency, and that should be his role. And therefore, the MP should keep the MP role, and then you should have ministers. People have made recommendations. They say when they go to the polls, they want to see the ministers there. They want to know who they are voting for. They want to vote for the Prime Minister separate from the MP. People say when you go behind that ballot box, what you need to see on it is the MP for the constituency, and then you must know who the Prime Minister is going to be so that you have a vote. So that if there are two options, that's what you have. So people have very various ways of determining how is it that we domesticate the Constitution, but also how is it that we ensure that people are sovereign. And in a sense, what does that mean? A gentleman asks, okay, all these lands are vested in the Crown now. Are they going to be now vested in the people? And then I ask, and if we vest in the people, does that mean you can build a house on it tomorrow morning? So these are questions that we have to ask ourselves because people want rights. There are other rights that are not necessarily, in my view, for the Constitution, and perhaps for other legislation to be amended, etc. So the land issue is one, beach is one. There are groups in this country, for example, like our indigenous groups, and some people don't believe that we have true indigenous peoples. That's a discussion that's ongoing. But people are saying, I want to be recognized in the Constitution. We had previous discussions even outside of the Constitutional Reform Committee where some groups are saying, I want when you take up the census that I'm identified. So the census should say, I'm a Maroon, I'm a Taino. So all these rights are coming in. When the Constitutional Committees that met prior, some rights I would say were perhaps latent. Today they are no longer latent rights. They are rights that are on the table. What are we going to do? Are we going to open the book and say, okay, let all ideas contain and all rights will be recognized in various ways? What do we really want in terms of our own constitutional reform process based on what it is that we want to see within our own country? The issue of Commonwealth citizens, for example, the committee had met, and basically I think, David, I think we can say we had, within the committee itself, that we had reached some consensus in saying Commonwealth citizens should be considered foreigners. Because right now, Commonwealth citizens can participate in the electoral process. But many of our people are not necessarily Commonwealth citizens, let's say the US citizens. And we have seen those stories in the media, we have seen them play out in Parliament, etc. So is it that we should continue to retain the notion that Commonwealth citizens have a role to play in our democratic processes? And if you live abroad and you want to come back and serve, what are the prescriptions that you should adhere to? Should you, for example, be required to live in the country for a period of years prior? Persons have said, or should you have to renounce your citizenship? Which is what we do now. So there are various matters to be discussed as we go forward, even as we think of dispensing with King Charles. Some of the other areas as well also speak to, and this is my take on it too. Should the Constitution, for example, address state responsibilities? Some constitutions have provisions for state responsibilities. Some constitutions have responsibilities for citizen responsibilities. Are we going to consider those matters as part of what we want for ourselves? We just amended the Bill of Rights a couple of years ago. Do we want to review them? Are there new rights emerging that we want to include in them? So these are the areas. So the issue relating to the trajectory in terms of the time frame is a very important one. And I know the minister in her sectoral speech actually requested or urged both political parties to commit to the completion of the process. Because you can't go and say, okay, we are going republic. So we now have the Republic of Jamaica. And we now have a new president, whatever formulation that may be. I think most of the recommendations now are that the president should be non-executive, a non-executive president, even though some persons want an executive president. My view is that we should sit down and articulate the roles before determining what banner you put it under. So rather than just saying executive, non-executive, what is it that we want this president to do? What is it that this prime minister should do? People talk about fixed term elections. So the other question we should ask ourselves, if we have fixed term elections and at the end of the fixed term, you don't have a viable alternative, what do? Do you just put in the other party? Because there's a fixed term election. So the question, some of the questions go to, as I said, our maturity as a people, where is it that we want to go? And I'm not suggesting that we need to be static now in 2023. The issue for me is we need to determine, as I've said, what is it that we want this country to look like? What are the rights and responsibilities of citizens and state alike? And how is it that we are going to ensure that those rights are enshrined, and what are those rights? I am in the culture sector. There are discussions for obia to be legalized. That is freedom of religion. The Constitution already grants you that. So in other words, we were in a session on this week in Westmoreland, and the gentleman asked, what are we talking about the church? In other words, do you now review the national anthem, which is a prayer? How many things do we review? There are many symbols that we'll have to get rid of. In the criminal law, what are we going to do? Is it the state? Are the offenses against the state? Are the offenses against the people? You know, so there are many other issues. I looked at the officer the other day in his was an inspector, and you look at his buttons, they all have the crown somewhere. Right. So clearly you have to get rid of the uniform. So it's also, in other words, it's an expensive process as well, and people are also calling, I'm putting another term, almost like a cost-benefit analysis. What will it cost the country? What is the benefit to me as a citizen of this country? So there are many issues being discussed. I'm going to end now. The committee is inviting submissions, so you send the submissions into the ministry. You're invited to come to the committee. Those submissions are also streamed as well, so that the rest of the diaspora can listen and make their comments in terms of what the work is that we are doing. I must say, however, and I think David raised it, in terms of the public consultation process, is that when you go into a town, you really don't get a room with 150 people. And so the question is it that people are not interested? Or is it that there must be another methodology? Many times we go out, we are discussing matters that people have no clue about, because the Constitution is not something that is taught in schools. People don't know their rights, etc. So I think as those of us who have a better or a greater understanding of what the process is, or what the processes are, I think we have a greater responsibility and accountability to those who don't. Back in the day when the commissions were meeting, many Jamaicans couldn't read. Today, many of us can read, but we don't read. And we really don't. So what we do is we depend on the third-party interventions, we depend on the media, we depend on the social media persons, and they have a role to play. They do have a role to play, but we don't read. And those of us who can and who understand the system, as I said, I believe we have a greater responsibility and accountability. This is an accountable process. If we want to put in a political directorate, governance and legislative framework, the accountability must come two ways. I want to end with this. My youngest son said to me the other day driving, he said, "Mommy, we are not accustomed to rules. This country is not run according to rules," that's what he said. But if it is that we are asking those who govern us to be accountable to us, then the accountability must also go the other way. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lalita. You did go a little bit over time, but we will forgive you for that. And That's a warning to the person following you. What David Batts has said, the fact is that if this process is going to work correctly, it has to be a process that we make uniquely our own. That's easy for us to Jamaicanize anything. What's more difficult for us is that as Jamaicans of different stripes and different perspectives, to come together and respect each other in terms of our differences. So we are going to have to ensure that we consider all views and come together with something which is significant for all purposes, for all persons who are involved. And that, I think, is going to be an important, I try not to say obstacle, an important, what's that? Consideration. That is why we have pastors, to give you the right word. We're going to ask David Henry now to deal with what's the pitfalls and
consensus and contentious
consensus and yes. So following that's the way we.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you, Leighton, for your warm welcome. It's really a pleasure for me as well to be a part of this conversation with friends. Leighton, it was alleged, looked a little like me back in the day, but I'm sure that you all see that there's a significant difference and favoring in another direction. Like him, though, I share concerns about Lolita's colors, purple, but notwithstanding that, my friend David Batts and I go way back, as he indicated, from football days and in university and so on. I have been asked to share on areas of consensus and contentious issues in the moves for constitutional reform. As regards consensus, the Constitutional Reform Committee has agreed that the process for constitutional reform requires significant public education. And this is so for, among other things, the pervasive ignorance, and I use that term not in the pejorative sense, the pervasive ignorance in our society regarding the Constitution, as has already been said. This public education should include sharing what we believe is clear, simple, and understandable terms to the broad demographic of the Jamaican society, our children, youth, adults, elderly. What is a constitution? And what really is a republic, which is a form of government which is being advanced and envisaged? The classical definition of a republic is one where sovereignty resides in the people, government of the people, by the people, for the people. And CRC has agreed, that's the Constitutional Reform Committee has agreed, that public education, public engagement, consultations, receipt of submissions, both oral and in writing, are a necessary prerequisite to the formulation of recommendations by the CRC to be submitted through the Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs to the Cabinet to inform the drafting of the requisite bill to be laid before Parliament for constitutional reform. Public education, as Lalita said, has already started, and is to be further advanced through the Jamaica Information Service. In fact, the GIS initiative, I understand, commences today and should run for 6 months. The committee has invited individuals and groups to make written and oral presentations to the committee, and we have heard quite a number of submissions from various civil society organizations, community stakeholders, and individuals expressing a wide range of views. And we have also embarked on a series of stakeholder and town hall meetings in different parishes. Now, the bill. What is it that is being proposed in the bill? What are the areas prioritized for reform? Well, there is consensus in the following areas. 1, substituting the monarchical form of government by which King Charles III is King of Jamaica to a republican form of government. 2, Jamaicanizing the Constitution of Jamaica by having our Constitution enacted in Jamaica rather than as it now exists, as has been expressed, as an order in council, a schedule made by the British monarch in Buckingham Palace. And it's interesting, we are in this space where I understand some of the drafting may have taken place and then the bill was taken up to England, passed by Buckingham Palace. For these reforms to be made, it will require the approval of the electorate in a referendum after the passage of a bill with 2/3 majority support through the Houses of Parliament. A significant issue raised by a number of commentators, however, is whether Jamaica should adopt a presidential system of government such as exists in the United States. As an example. This move would represent a radical change in our system of government, and both political parties would need to support such a change. The committee, however, as presently advised, is not persuaded that this is desirable, workable, and in the best interest of Jamaica. And we are of this view in light of the example of other nations, for example, Latin American countries and Sri Lanka, and our own experience in governance as a nation for 61 years since independence. We favor the retention of a parliamentary democracy. Under this system, a president may be appointed as head of state and the prime minister as head of government. The committee has commenced consideration whether, in light of the costs of maintaining a formal head of state as a president, if it is necessary or desirable to retain such an office. We are of the view that if the office of the president is to be established, the holder's roles and functions should be clearly specified, and it would be distinct from the office of the prime minister. The Joint Select Committee of Houses of Parliament on Constitutional and Electoral Reform report, that's in May of 1995, that committee was headed by the late Justice James Carr. They proposed that the role of the president should include certain executive functions. And this includes the appointment of persons to what are described as sensitive roles in government, such as our governance, our Chief Justice, President of the Court of Appeal, appointed members of the Judicial Service Commission, chairman and members of the Police Service Commission, the Public Defender, the Contractor General, which role no longer exists, the Electoral Commission, that is the independent members. And then we have had discussions about how should the president be elected. It has been preliminarily proposed, and I underline the word preliminarily because as a committee, we listen and we will be having dialogue before we come to a consensus position which we'd advance. It has been preliminarily proposed, consistent with the Carr report, that the president be nominated by the Prime Minister in consultation with the Leader of the Opposition and confirmed by the affirmative resolution of Parliament, with both houses sitting together with a vote of 2/3 majority of all members. There are, however, strong views that the president should be directly elected by the people. We have been hearing that people say we want to elect our own president. It is my view that election of the president directly by the electorate is not inconsistent with a parliamentary democracy. There are also strong views that the prime minister should also be directly elected, as well as senators. That's a view. In terms of general consensus, the CRC is of the view that any reference to any country other than Jamaica in the Constitution should be as a foreign country. As such, there would be the removal from the Constitution of any reference to the Commonwealth and any privilege attached to Jamaica's relationship to the Commonwealth. So in a broad sense, I've just spoken to areas of consensus and some kind of weighing of issues. Let me now deal with contentious issues. A number of us are of the view that there is need for other significant changes in our system of governance. There's a concentration of powers in the office of the Prime Minister, which has facilitated prime ministerial dictatorship, some have said bullying, and improper exercise of powers by the government of Jamaica. Now, when I speak in this way, I'm actually reflecting positions that I've heard and also what I've seen. And these positions have in fact been said by leaders on both sides of the political divide. I want to share 3 recent developments which have galvanized my view that we need to advocate for appropriate changes in our system of governance now, beyond the abolition of the monarchy, appointment of a president, and enacting our constitution in Jamaica. 1, pay hikes to political leaders. In the face of clear acknowledgement by the government of Jamaica of A, poor performance and poor performance by some MPs and ministers, B, the absence of job description for parliamentarians and ministers. This is now being corrected after the fact. And thirdly, in the absence of accountability structures and systems, performance indicators, evaluations, or appraisals, the significant pay hike to all MPs and ministers is tantamount to paying oneself from the public purse for abject inefficiency, woefully inadequate performance, and rewarding poor performers. The display of purported solidarity by the Prime Minister and leader of the opposition with the masses who are economically suffering by not accepting their salary increases lacks substance, since all other salary increases to the political directorate remain intact. The credibility, in my opinion, of all parliamentarians has been compromised by the shadowy manner in which the pay hike issue was addressed, and reinforces distrust, I believe, in the general citizenry of those who lead us and the system of governance. Someone mentioned earlier that people don't vote, and there's a falling off. In fact, our last election was 38%, the lowest in our nation's history. Of enumerated persons, right. And I believe that some of these kinds of things are the reasons why people are saying, well, disinterested. In these circumstances, in fact, I believe that the Constitutional Reform Committee, of which I sit, may be viewed as willing conduits for foisting symbolic changes, that is, removing the monarch, appointing a president, which disguises the continuance and perpetuation of the dictatorial rule of the government of Jamaica through its control of the executive and legislative arms of government, manifested so outrageously, in my opinion, in the pay hike saga. Secondly, the attempts by the government of Jamaica to neuter the Integrity Commission, which was appointed as a watchdog for integrity, transparency, and accountability of the government, is cause, I believe, for alarm and concern. And thirdly, the developments that have culminated in the July 28, 2023 passage of the amendment to the Constitution to increase the age of retirement of the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Auditor General to 65 years and to allow for extensions of same up to 70 years is cause for concern. I want to align myself with the statement issued by the Jamaican Bar Association that, and I'm quoting from them, there are serious, compelling questions as to the validity of these amendments, in particular, whether the amendments and the manner and procedure by which they were made contravene the Constitution, end of quote. As many of us may know, the matter is in fact being challenged, or it has been indicated it's going to be challenged in the courts, and so certain persons on this panel cannot say anything about it. The matter is in fact being challenged in the courts, and the Governor General has been asked not to assent to the bill, although I understand the bill may in fact have been passed. Jambar noted, and I agree, that there are aspects of this matter that are indisputable and highly undesirable. The amendments were carried through Parliament without the consultative process that ought to be adhered to, respected, and employed in matters concerning an amendment to the Constitution, being the supreme law of the land. They continue, of equal concern is that the absence of consultation appeared on any objective analysis to be deliberate. The hasty passage of the bill proposing to amend the Constitution caught the nation, and from all reports, opposition legislators by surprise. There was no opportunity in the lower house, from all reports, for any informed or prepared debate on the bill. And I want to say and admit very candidly that the changes also took the Constitutional Reform Committee entirely by surprise. And we shall be discussing the implications at an emergency meeting, hopefully to be held this week. To further quote from Jambar's press release, to describe the amendment as simple as was done by the Honourable Minister of Justice in his address to Parliament on Tuesday, 25th July 2023, is reflective of the scant regard for the weighty matters that arise from the amendments in question and the assurance of a parliamentary majority which guarantees a planned outcome regardless of the undesirability and potential unconstitutionality of the process. They continue, the Constitution is and has been judicially described as a living instrument, and Jambar is firm in his position that this hallowed instrument must at all times be accorded treatment and that recognizes its supremacy. The mere adherence to the provisions that set out the required parliamentary vote does not automatically mean the results are cloaked in constitutionality. The procedure adopted or not adopted and the purpose for which the amendment is made are critical factors in any assessment as to whether an act is constitutional and conforms with the spirit of the Constitution. And in fact, Jambar went on to urge the government not to apply the amendments to the incumbent DPP because it would raise a kind of shroud of distrust over the offices of the DPP and the Auditor General. That is a risk they said that no responsible government should seek to assume. It is critical for good governance and the transparency that is so central to Jamaica's democracy that these two offices are seen to be independent and uninfluenced by political or other factors. I've highlighted 3 areas that have caused me concern then as to how we manage our separation of powers and the powers that ought to reside in government. To address these matters of governance and other areas of concern, it is my view that the Constitutional Reform Committee in its remit should give attention to addressing now a number of areas, and these have already been mentioned. Term limits for parliamentarians, appointments to the Senate, qualification for ministers. We need to talk about fixed election dates, impeachment of public officials, possibility of recall elections of parliamentarians, entrenchment of the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, which has done sterling work in our nation, and that ought to be enshrined in our Constitution, in my opinion. Entrenchment of the Integrity Commission. Consider the adoption of the appellate jurisdiction of the Caribbean Court of Justice. It's my own view that it's inconsistent with our being a republic for us to go to the King's Court to be advised as to how our laws are to be interpreted. Now, as to where the final court should reside, there is a Caribbean Court of Justice, but there needs to be a full and frank discussion as to where our final court should be. Removal of qualification for parliamentary seats of common citizens who are not Jamaican citizens. And we need to talk also about the role of the diaspora, which Lalita spoke about earlier on. A number of these matters have been significantly opined on by the previous commission and other Jamaicans, so there is groundwork in place to move us forward. And it is my view that it should be the ambitious, I describe it, that it should be the ambitious and sacred undertaking of the government of Jamaica and the opposition to address the deepest and needful concerns and aspirations of the Jamaican people. Political aspirations, electioneering, and other political considerations should not be given priority and primacy over and above the interests and well-being of the Jamaican people. It is my view that both political parties should therefore solemnly undertake to advance the work of constitutional reform across the constitutional life of the current and the next parliament to ensure we have our republic which truly embodies government of the people, by the people, for the people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The two Davids have been stirring us on either side of Lalita. We are going to change how we had set up our program before, and we are going to go directly to questions from the audience. I think that what has been said has brought several questions to mind, and so therefore we are going to arrange that. We're going to start first with persons from the live audience here. We're going to ask you, for microphone purposes, to come right here and ask a question so that you can, because remember, we are also catering to an online audience, and so therefore it's important that they hear you also. So I see that gentleman there who wants to go first. I'm asking you to make the questions brief and pointed. As he comes, yes, you.
You should be clear and present. It's not a question, it's a comment.
It's a comment, yes, question or comment. Yes, please come forward. We ask you, if I can just say before he starts first, that the great Jamaican fast bowler Michael Holding was very good off his long run, but when he needed to, he bowled off the short run. We're asking everybody to bowl off the short run today so that we can go through very quickly.
My comment will be in keeping with my height. I finish at about 7 o'clock. And the comment is to thank most sincerely the organizers of this presentation here this afternoon. God bless you all, and you Kengele, I want to thank you in a very special way. But for me, it is a very significant presentation because today marks the 185th anniversary of our ancestors being registered as persons. So there is nothing else you put in your journal. We are all given a name. Hitherto, we were named as animals. I often wonder why my pet named Lucy, just like Auntie Lucy, and I now know. So I want to commend you all and to thank you most sincerely.
Thank you very much. Let's give it to
Greetings. Enjoyed your presentation. And greetings to everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I just have one comment to make, very brief, and that is about value system. You know, people have different value systems. If you go into Olympic Gardens, there is a proverb that is said, "Some are dead that others might live." In other words, I can't survive unless I kill a man and take his money. And we cannot take it for granted that everybody thinks the same way about what is important, what is right, and what is wrong. There's another proverb I saw written on the Sandy Gully wall: "Rob the rich, not the poor." So people have different views, different ways of thinking about what is right and wrong, what is true or false. All people's value systems are not the same. And our value systems are rooted in our beliefs, what we believe about truth, what we believe about right and wrong. But I want to simply say that according to the Judeo-Christian worldview from which I come, the prophet Isaiah said that God says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Now, if we think of the Creator as being all-knowing, all-wise, and that he knows the future better than any one of us, then we could exercise our faith. Perhaps he knows better than I do, even if I don't agree sometimes with what he might say. Perhaps he knows more than I do, and I should set aside what I personally like and do what he wants me to do. Now that is the struggle, Constitutional Reform Committee. The struggle to really dig deep and find out on what basis do I place my values. In closing, I want to suggest that you keep in mind that our whole culture, if we think about the words of the national anthem, is based on the view that there is an eternal Father whose wisdom exceeds all human wisdom. That's why we ask him to grant true wisdom from above to our leaders, and that justice and truth will be ours forever. That is a worldview that comes from the Judeo-Christian worldview. Even that part of the anthem that says, "Give us vision lest we perish," is a quotation from the book of Proverbs in the Bible. My most important concern, Constitutional Reform Committee members represented here, is the value system that may be represented in the new Constitution. We're very concerned about that. More than anything else, I think I speak for many Christians, we are concerned about the value system that will be the foundation for this new Constitution. Thank you.
Just two things before our next question from the audience here. There is a question online which I think follows in relation to that, and I'm trying to ensure that these lovely people who are here are also given an opportunity. And the question is whether separation of church and state applies to Jamaica. So we're going to ask maybe one or two of the panelists to address that, and then we'll hear from Ms. Richards. And also, I'm going to say that the last person got an A in terms of content, but in terms of brevity did not. And I will not be allowing persons to fall below the line in terms of brevity again. Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Does this work? Yes. Is there a separation or ought there to be a separation? What is the question?
The question is, does separation of church and state apply in Jamaica?
Okay. Well, the short answer is yes. And it is reflected in the right to freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. So many of us, or all of us, too young to remember that there was a time when if you were not a Christian, it was a crime. Simple. The Spanish, not just the English. Okay, they were all states heavily religious. The English settled that dispute long before Christopher Columbus arrived in this part of the world. Their revolution and counter-revolution. And a big part of it was an issue between religions, between the Catholics and the Anglicans. And in the long run, the concession was, well, look, let every man believe what he wants. Let the state be governed according to principles enshrined. We call it now a constitution. The British had a series of laws which established, and the French had the rights of man. So the constitution is designed to reflect values which are inherently good, inherently for us, but not premised on religion. And there's a good practical reason for that. Religion has proven over time to be inherently divisive. More wars have been fought in the history of mankind because of religion than any other single reason. Because everybody believes that my God is the right God. And if we start to build a society on that premise, then it's either you're going to say nobody can have any other God, or you're going to say, well, if you're going to come here, you're going to live according to our religious precepts. All right? The good thing is that most religions, I may get controversial here, but many religions share a basic set of principles. Even the Muslims, if you take the time to look at the Quran, all right, their basic tenets are not too far removed from the Christians. So there is a workable arrangement in our Constitution, and we can respect the views of others while ascribing to these common set of principles.
Nobody else? Okay, very well. Okay, there are aspects of what might have been said which I'm sure are interested, and you can have a conversation afterwards. But I don't want us to go off so much of the constitutional reform area. Mrs. Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Afternoon to everybody. I just wondered with the committee, how is consensus arrived at? When you say you arrive at a consensus, does it mean a majority vote? Firstly, also, what do you see as being the next steps? And then also, I wonder, isn't the committee concerned about a court, the CCJ, which markets itself as an apex court with responsibility to reset and to bridge the gap between law and society? It also is an executing agency for donor funds. So whilst I understand and I'm sympathetic and so on with the view that we should leave the Privy Council, I have concerns about the CCJ, and so I wonder if the CRC is aware of these concerns and whether they share these concerns. Thank you.
Okay, so the consensus question first, and then the CCJ question.
So let me answer the first question, which is how is consensus arrived at? There is a process as outlined by Lalita and myself in terms of public consultations and so on, after which we will be deliberating, and then we will, by a majority, come to a position on the various issues that are before us to then say, this is what we will recommend.
So that's a consensus of the committee?
Of the committee.
And so this is the committee going forward? And
the minority positions will also be recorded as well. Right? So as it is right now, there's really no consensus position on even those issues I've indicated. They are preliminary consensus positions because we are still in the process of hearing from the various groups and so on. But we at least wanted to come to a position on matters so that we can put it out there and invite feedback. And then we are going to be deliberating on those. A majority position will be taken, minority will be indicated, and then we'd advance those through the minister to the cabinet. So I hope that answers as well next steps in the process, right? Now, insofar as the CCJ issue is concerned, we really, the opposition has really been very strong on this. They have raised it at every opportunity that we need to discuss this. The government of Jamaica, on the other hand, has another position. What has been agreed is that we need to have a fulsome discussion on the CCJ, bearing in mind all of what you have just said, Shirley, and a number of other concerns. In any event, and which is what I was trying to say in the conversation so far, it is certainly my view, let me just express my view, that at the end of the day, we need a final court of appeal, which ought not to be the King's Court. That's my opinion, right? I'm just expressing my opinion on the matter, all right?
Sorry, Shirley, before you continue, just to follow up on the notion of consensus. And I also want to acknowledge Senator Donna Scott Martley, who is also a member of the committee, and she's sitting in here with us. The ideal for the committee is that the committee will have not just a majority, but that the members will agree. In fact, we have had discussions where we didn't move on because we did not all agree on a particular point. So the objective is that we'll all agree. However, as David has said, if it is that there are dissenting views, then those are contrary views, and those views would also be documented. But recall that what the committee really does is to make the recommendations, submit them to the minister, who submits them to the cabinet, and after cabinet, then it would go to the government in terms of both houses.
Thank you. All right, so the order would be Dr. McDowell. Oh, okay. Mr. Motley, then that gentleman there in a purple shirt, which I think should be banned. That is the order we have. Yeah? So that's a good reason why it should be banned. But anyway, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
My wife can beat me when I get home. I want to say something about us in the Caribbean. I am not a fragmentologist, if that is the term that I should use. I am a strong integrationist and a strong understanding of what our people had to go through to make these countries our own today. And what is going on is that I would like to see, for example, that we do not talk about knighthoods, nor we don't talk about all the other things that spin off from the Queen's panties, etc., etc., etc. I am a believer that if we want to honor people, we can call him a kabaka after one of the African chiefs or whatever it is. In other words, we need to orient our thoughts as to our own simple strengths over and over and over again, and not all this. I'm not a Queen's employee, you know, never was. Other people I know maybe, but I do not. But I feel very strongly that we in the Caribbean should begin to define ourselves in our own language, period. Full stop, cross it however you want to. And I am tired of hearing a lot of people trying to justify it. I was in Jamaica when they kicked out the Queen. You see that little girl there that ran in Barbados? She learned under her father, myself, and our friends under the sofa because she couldn't go sleep at night. She would come outside to hear what we were saying about that.
Remember the brevity restrictions. Short run-up.
Right, I'll get some wine up now. But the point I'm making is that we tolerate too often the nonsense that we have inherited and refuse to continue to teaching our children and ourselves exactly how we should change and make this Caribbean our own. It is possible. Thank you very much. I didn't mean to say all this, but
let me just respond quickly. One of the presentations we actually had before the committee came from the linguistics institute in the University of the West Indies. Mm-hmm. And the issue is whether or not we should, in this constitutional reform process, formally recognize Jamaican as a language. That's one. Secondly, we have had discussions and we have agreed that the Constitution will have its own preamble, because the preamble should be those philosophical ideals that we want for our people. And there's also the suggestion that that also be translated into Jamaican. So those discussions are actually taking place.
Thanks, Justice. So good evening, colleagues. My name is Michael McAnuff-Jones. I didn't go to Kingston College, but I went to Knox College. Works. I heard David talking earlier, David, about the Prime Ministerial Authority. And so I have that concern I want just to ask. So there is this recurring theme of the Governor General or the head of state being advised by the Prime Minister, which doesn't seem to be advice because he dare not refuse. And so I wanted to ask, where does that kind of construct go in the deliberations, where advice is not really advice, and some of the advice should be refused, as many of us can attest. The other thing that concerns me, and I want to hear the views of the committee, in 1975, the Governor General of Australia fired the Prime Minister, who had before said if he ever met God, he would talk to him as an equal. And Governor General terminated him. The Prime Minister said, God saved the Queen, but nothing can save the Governor General. I want to know, does the CRC contemplate a situation where a head of state could be empowered without the need for parliamentary approval to terminate the government in the interest of the public? And the third thing is this issue of the Governor General, the head of state, being able to retire a citizen who is a public servant in the public interest, which nobody seems to be able to define. And I don't know where that came from. So I'm kind of wondering, is there a part of the conversation, does this include the seemingly unchallenged level of authority of the Governor General to retire public servants who a politician may not like, and they are then retired in the public interest on the advice of the Prime Minister. So I wanted to ask kind of what are the thoughts of the CRC on those issues?
Thanks for those questions, Mike. The CRC has in fact appointed a subcommittee to look at what the role of the President should be, and also what the role then of the Prime Minister should be, and how those roles would relate to each other. So at this point in time, I can't answer those questions definitively, but I can say that those are issues which will have to be addressed as to what the role of the President would be, what the role of the Prime Minister would be, and how those roles would function vis-a-vis each other.
If I may make one comment before Lalito. One of the things that I think that the last 5 years, or was it 6 years or so, has taught us internationally, that the foundation of a democracy is not just elections, but it's also a fair and independent civil service. In other words, persons who are committed to serving the country, but are not aligned to any political view. I think that one of the criticisms, the American system has many advantages. One of the criticisms is that they have so many persons who are appointed by the president and has that particular tint. I think that there's something which was said that under the Kennedy presidency, between then and now, the amount of persons appointed by the president has gone up more than 10 times. And so therefore, it is something which I think is disturbing their system. I think I can make this comment as a general comment, that there are considerations within Jamaica that is something which is growing too much.
Right, thanks. And just 2 quick points here. In relation to the question you asked about what the Governor General, in terms of the tenure of the Prime Minister, I think one of the issues that I know we are discussing is to ensure that whatever governance and legislative framework we put in or we recommend, that it affords the kind of stability that the country needs in times of, let's call it in times of flux, that you have that stability in place. I also know that one of the issues being discussed is the role of the civil servant and the independence of the civil service in terms of the non-interference by the political electorate in the civil service. So I know that's also a pet peeve of the minister in terms of ensuring that the people who serve us as civil servants reflect the same value system that we are discussing here in terms of what it is that we want to see of our future Jamaica.
Okay. If I may, there's one other question which is online, which I think is something which has linked to some of the other things that we've asked. Someone, Mrs. Andrews, is asking, what about dual citizens? Persons, and I think you mentioned part of that, David, in relation to that. The position originally in the Constitution was that the Commonwealth citizens had all the rights in Jamaica, and also Jamaicans have been able to go to England. I know somebody who went there to study and was able to vote in the election because they were a Commonwealth citizen, whereas US citizens or citizens of a foreign power, US or anywhere else, wouldn't have those powers. So the question is, we have so many in the diaspora, what is going to happen in relation to them? What is the argument in terms of those persons? In one sentence or less.
So let me make it a sentence. That we can make very long sentences. So the issue really is, and we have not determined as yet, but the discussion is ongoing. So everybody outside of a Jamaican is a foreigner for purposes of particularly participation in our
So if I'm Jamaican and Barbadian citizen,
so you would have dual citizenship.
Yes, so I'm a Jamaican. So I'm not a foreigner.
You're not a foreigner, you're a Jamaican. The issue now is if you wish to be a part of representational politics, should you be asked to renounce your Barbados citizenship? And if the answer is in the affirmative, do you still require some kind of residency requirement before you can enter? If the answer is in the negative, meaning you can retain both citizenships, how do we treat with you? Because the issue is you are swearing allegiance to two countries.
So if I'm a reggae boy who has never lived in Jamaica, but I'm Jamaican because my grandfather is, and I get a passport, I can come back having won the World Cup, renounce my British citizenship, and then run to become Prime Minister.
But then the residency requirement would also now have to be a prerequisite,
okay.
Right? But then remember, the big issue is,
so that route is
can you represent your country? Can you swear allegiance to Jamaica when you're swearing allegiance to another foreign state?
Okay. All right. Vote, yes. Voting as a dual citizen. Thank you. The question is, can a dual citizen?
If you are Jamaican, you can vote.
Okay.
But the issue, remember, one of the other issues is whether or not you can, in terms of the diaspora now, whether or not you can vote from overseas. So that's a discussion that's also has been going on for a while in Jamaica, and it's also an issue being discussed within the committee.
Okay. All right, we may have an opportunity for 2 more questions. We are trying to, to keep within our time, which is very un-Jamaican, but we're trying to.
Okay, hi, good afternoon. It's an honor to be in the presence of such prominent jurists and counsel.
Is you she talking about?
Yes, good afternoon all. I just think that it needs to be kind of unequivocally said, especially in a space like this, and as a believer and as soon to be attorney as well, I think I'm well positioned to state this, that this exercise of constitutional reform as believers, something that we must remember, it is not an exercise in Christianizing Jamaica, and I think much of our population has a gripe with us as believers over them feeling that that is what the Christian population is trying to do. On the question of value system, while it is valid, I think it's needs to be remembered that the cause of Christ in Jamaica and advancing that cause is about introducing Christ to people and having them know him first. I think any kind of legislative process or any kind of legislative result must be exactly that, a result of people's hearts changing, people's lives changing, people encountering Christ, as many of us have, and then producing that result.
Let me just respond to you quickly. On that note, a gentleman asked us sometime last week, what do we mean by church? In other words, he asked, what is church? In other words, is church Christianity? What is church? I also want to say that many of us as Christians perhaps don't know that in many fora in this country today, there is no prayer. I just want us to know that. Because depending on the form that you're in, the presumption is that it is multi-religion, different people, and therefore I should not force you to say amen to a prayer. So I just want to say that the practice is already here, right? So that's one. The other issue that we raised, we had a town hall this week as well, and two persons from the church actually said that they believe this is a political process, that the church should stay out of it, basically, because they were suggesting that we should engage the church in a more formal way in terms of having the discussions in church, in services. That's why the gentleman actually asked us, what is church? But there are persons who also still believe that this is a separate process. In other words, the notion of being spiritual, you have a spiritual process that's separate from a secular process. And that therefore there's that divide. So Christians must engage within certain contexts. So I mention it because I think what you have said is very important in terms of how we go forward. And I also want to say to us as Christians that what we knew as religion years ago is not the same today. It's just not the same. And so when we say, the question came earlier, the separation of church and state, as believers, we have to make that decision. What does that mean? What does that mean for us? And what are we saying in the Constitution? Because remember, we already have freedom of religion. And that is a big thing, by the way. because we have freedom of religion.
Okay. And well, if there's nobody else, we have to go back to you. Unless there's anybody else who had... Okay, I'm sorry. There are just a couple of people who had... I think, Professor Miller, is that your hand up? I don't know if it is up or beside your head or something like that. Last year in our governance series, Professor Miller spoke about the involvement of persons from church in government and those other areas. So it is good to continue that discussion here. Yes, sir.
My hand went up and almost came down.
I see.
Because when I listened, it seemed to me that we want to start Jamaica over from scratch in 2023-24. That
we started from scratch in 1962?
The whole...
No, it's a question. Did we start from scratch in 1962?
Not at all. But many of the reasons of the constitutions we are saying is not the constitution of the people. Is because Jamaica... Is because...
Sorry, could you just... a little bit closer?
Sorry. Yes. And I'm taking account of where I am, you know, and it seems to be almost sacrilegious to say that the constitution that we have is not Jamaican, because the fact of the matter is that Jamaica came into being through some of the highest expressions of democracy, a referendum, and when the government lost the referendum, said we will allow the people to choose who will form the government. To accuse those people of not being Jamaican and Jamaicanized and so on, to me, is, you know, because the fact of the matter is, the reason for a lot of things in the Jamaican Constitution is that it couldn't be decided whether it would have been Sir Alexander or Norman Manley would be elected. And it was left to the people. The people are sovereign. We do not make them sovereign. And we cannot speak about Jamaican democracy without adult suffrage in 1944. Because then it is when, and a lot of the questions we're talking about have been decided by the Jamaican people in elections. If we fail to recognize that political parties have campaigned and on many of the issues we are talking about. In addition, the lowest turnout for a legitimate election in Jamaica was 2.67% in 1983, and the government that was elected was legitimate. So, and most of all, if we're talking as Christians, we have not yet begun to critically analyze the ways in which Christianity in Jamaica has changed, the churches over the course of the 20th century, and the difference that is making, and why we have the confusion with America. We are talking about America being a more mature democracy than us. You got to be kidding. In the light of what happened, is happening now. Because really what you have in the United States is 51 elected kings. Each to set up their own thing, one federal king, and power in any society must rely somewhere. And I would argue, and I'll put it this way, I believe that the primary thing we should be doing is removing the British monarch as the king of Jamaica. The Constitution sets it out very clearly. And the reasons for it, rationale for it, is that the British king is a symbol of British nationality. And we must have someone who is a Jamaican who represents our identity. We must also have someone who represents the unity of the country, separate from all of the battles that take place in politics, such that there is someone who is above power in the sense that he's not exercising the power and representing national unity, and the political process with all its machinations can take place under that. Our own political culture since 1962, has been developing norms and methods of going about things that have been civilizing it, not only by the law, but by the conventions that have been developing. Most of which is we have selected governors general from politics, from academia, from the church. And once that person becomes the governor general, that person has exercised it as well as any monarch anywhere in the world. We have a culture, therefore. The problem is, and power, there's no power involved in the process. It is all the pomp and the pageantry and the voluntary acceptance that this is ours. In other words, what I'm saying is, what my great concern is that the committee can mess up the process and miss this opportunity of making a change. Let us start with that one change. The Constitution says what it is. Let us all unite and educate the people of Jamaica as to what it means to do it and take the vote on it. Because this one change is the most important one, with the others coming later. I'm just expressing it.
Again, not a passing grade in relation to length, but certainly in relation to content. I want to ask, I think, one other question which has come online.
I'm sorry, I wanted to...
Oh, sorry.
The committee has to respond, but
David,
let me say, Professor Miller has given great service to this country. I mean, nobody can question his integrity and his commitment to Jamaica, and I salute you. But I say respectfully that when you begin by saying that we have been voting since 1944 and that a referendum to decide whether to federate or not, and that an election to decide whether PNP or JLP lead us into independence. If you are suggesting that that in 1962 was sufficient to educate the people of Jamaica about what a constitution is, what their rights and responsibilities are, and what the constitution meant in terms of national movement forward, if you are suggesting that those things was sufficient, then you either have not been paying attention to what has been happening in our country at the grassroots, or you are so intellectually high in the stratosphere that you forget. Because what is happening in Jamaica, what has happened, is that it's almost as if the plantation system has continued since 1962. You vote every 5 years, and you have nothing more to do or say. You're not entitled to participate in any meaningful way unless you join one of the parties and somebody there likes you and gives you an appointment. That's the reality that people face. So what one is suggesting, in 61 years after independence, now that we are looking at the Constitution, let us do it a different way. And let us not just talk about replacing. The king really is neither here nor there now, you know. He's only king when he's in Jamaica and he's never here. The governor general does everything that the king does. So in practical terms, the presence of the king means nothing. It's just symbolic. You said it. Let us deal with real things. Let us deal with the things mentioned here about protecting the members of the Integrity Commission, constitution by entrenchment. Let us deal with things like the question of who is our final court of appeal. And let us have the people have a view on it.
Can you give the other David?
I'm going to respond somewhere in between where David is and Professor is. By that I mean, I believe what I understand Prof to be saying is that there is a rich legacy that we should not discard.
Yes.
And I am acknowledging that rich legacy. and those who formed the Constitution, some of whom may have been in this room drafting it, did a significant job to ensure, in a real sense, a kind of a democracy which has worked for us. It has worked for us, but there are many gaps. And we are acknowledging that there are issues that we need to address in the journey towards where we need to be as a republic. And in that regard, I want to express my own view that it is desirable for us to have a president as a person who represents national identity and unity, and that we, in fact, as I think we all are agreed that we need to get rid of King Charles. And I'm saying that in inverted, we need to move on to a republican form of government and enact a constitution in a Jamaican instrument. I think that's an important part of the process. What I have submitted is we should not be content to stop there, although I know that's the easier thing to do. But in light of our record, our history, and how we have seen how the thing have played out, which is where I'm going, where David is now, issues like Integrity Commission and enshrining Electoral Commission, dealing with some of those issues that are the reasons behind why people are not engaged in the democracy. And I want to feel that we should come to some kind of consensus on those kinds of issues at this stage. We are 61 years of age. And we should be able to address some of those and not be content to just say, okay, we get rid of King Charles and we have a constitution that's made in Jamaica. That's my own position.
Let me just add just one thing. In terms of the committee, I also want to put on record that there is a clear and a strong recognition that our democracy has served us well. And that in terms of the review of the Constitution, we are not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So that's one. And the other thing, too, is that the committee started this work with an in-depth look at what the work of the other constitutional reform committees, what they have achieved, what were the recommendations, what recommendations have already been in terms of taken on board, and what other recommendations that we also now need to take on board, in addition to those other issues which we identified that would not have arisen at the time, perhaps because those issues were latent, or perhaps they were not of any political or national importance, but that currently those issues are now on the table being discussed.
All right, I'm going to, somebody we're going to end, and some of the conversations will continue afterwards. I'm going to ask Dr. McDowell. He's been asking a question, and I want him to formulate it. He's asking a question about for the panel, what it means to be sovereign. And I'd like him to explain, articulate the question that you're asking, and we can hear a response for that. Huh? Well, yes, you could ask it rather than articulate. That's lawyer talking. They affected me.
Good evening, everybody. I didn't want to be put on the floor like this, but thank you very much, Leighton. Well organized. We keep saying constitutional reform. We speak about a sovereign nation, and we almost say it as if we all understand it. I'm just asking, I'd actually ask, could you explain a little bit more what it means to be a sovereign nation? So as simple as that.
So let me start, and I think it's a good point, because we are a sovereign nation. Within the International Free League, we are a sovereign nation. Jamaica is a sovereign nation. I think the issue is the discussion about the republic making people, in other words, David used his term, by the people, for the people. I think it's an important point of departure for us to understand what that means. Because as we have said in other fora, you could wave the most beautifully written document and it doesn't change anything. Because until people understand what it means, that you can make a decision for yourself, that as a people we can define who we are, and Prof said it as well. Who are we as Jamaicans? So there are many things that we have learned, and there are other initiatives outside of the Constitutional Reform Committee that are addressing some of these very issues in terms of who is a Jamaican. And really, as I said, we have to teach people what it means to be, we are sovereign people. So there's nothing that we are doing now that's taking away the sovereignty. The issue of what we call the repatriation of the Constitution, Prof raised a question as well, is that it's going to be now passed by the Jamaican Parliament. So in essence, when we go to referendum and we address the fundamental legislative and governance frameworks, what we'll have is most of the Constitution remaining as it is in the first instance. But then go back to what David said. What are those other things that we need to do as of right and now for our people to ensure the level of accountability that we want to see in this country? And what role do people play in that process? Because I'm of the view that this process, so the committee didn't call this meeting, but Jamaicans are taking it on and having their own consultations. That to me is a reflection of people assuming the role that this process is mine and that I want to be a part of that.
Okay. I have 30 seconds. If you say 30 seconds, you will get 30 seconds.
It is a great mistake to separate God from life. He's the one that gives us life and the intelligence to be able to cope with life's problems. And with regard to government, whatever form of government it is, God, who is a creator, must also be the ruler. He must set the rules. And if any government disobey those rules are invalid.
You actually have about 3 seconds left. You have about 3 or 4 seconds left. Thank you very much. I see Professor Miller, you're going to be 30 seconds also? 30 seconds? Okay.
Justice, I tell you, I follow you, I respect you. I also tell you this. The last time I was chastised, as you have done today, was in December 2000 by both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition.
Excellent.
Who said, you people who come from the university, you have no idea of runnings on the ground. And my answer to him is, fine, sir. But if we manage to clean up the system, will you both promise to establish the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, which was promised in 1979? Yeah. I rest my case.
Okay, I think that was...
That commission now needs to be entrenched in the Constitution.
In fact, I haven't looked at the legislation recently, but for many years, the legislation that dealt with the Electoral Commission says temporary or something. Yeah, and it has been temporary since the 1980s or something like that. 2000. It was confirmed. The temporary.
It was changed. It's not entrenched.
It was 2010.
But it has not been.
Okay, and we don't comment on Parliament, remember? Yes, so having said that, I'm going to invite Yekengele to give the vote of thanks. I like father, like son, that you keep within the...
I wrap up things, I do. I don't because, first of all, let me just express a fulsome heart in being really grateful to all who have participated, beginning, of course, with the time and the energies spent by all of the panelists. David, both the Davids, Lalita, again. Lalita was with us, I think, when we did something on reparations. And the light that is shed, even if it's among a small amount of people in the beginning, because I can clearly say that the light that has been shed on the subjects that we've been talking about, there are sparks flying in my head, and I know that there are sparks flying in people's head, which are going to be the subject of other conversations, people to people and people to pulpit to pew and whatnot and have you, and so we fulsomely I believe that I'm echoing a really a spirit of gratitude that the committee, which represents basically the state in motion, and the conversations that's happening here, the church. Last year, the whole point of having these conversations was recognizing that people need to talk to each other about issues. Even when we don't agree, that's when we need to talk, because we need to be clear that we're not misunderstanding positions. So we're very grateful. We're grateful to Leighton, who has, for the first time, moderated one of these conversations for us. His time has come. and did so very excellently. And of course, I want to thank everyone here who participated. I'd like also to let you know that it's not just talk. We're really grateful. We have some refreshments for you back here when we're done, so that some of the banter and the conversation can continue. And lastly, I would like to, I've spoken for CCLN. We have these conversations, I say, in the spirit of just increasing the spirit of understanding and hopefully, possibly, to increase the spirit of consensus where it can. Because, of course, when we can act in consort, then let us. But I also want to speak on behalf of the Manley Center. And if I may be afforded the privilege just to make a mention of a story. We spoke about that fateful referendum that Mr. Manley submitted his ideas to, that it had to pass the people test. That idea was that it was better for us as a Caribbean people to enter into independence together rather than as separate individual states. And in that, I believe Mr. Manley was visionary. Before the European Union, before the African Union, I guess it's only the United Kingdom and the United States of America that understood the power of collective sovereignty. And Mr. Manley, what many people don't know is that when he lost that election, he really lost everything. He had actually been spending or liquidating his assets to fund his political life. Very atypical for a Jamaican politician. The man goes into politics wealthy, one of the wealthiest lawyers, and he ends basically landless. Where we are now is called regardless because his wife then, Edna, after the elections was lost, Manley lost all of Drumblair Estate, which, to understand Drumblair Estate, Edna used to ride her horses galloping full speed. We're talking about 100 of acres at least. And this little lot of land was all that was left because Edna begged, wait, give me a little plot somewhere because you need to die somewhere. And so this little plot of land was the last legacy of the Manley once Drumblair Empire, where everybody knows the Jamaica that we are living in was envisioned and talked about, and it was a melting pot of the high intellects of the land. And I think it was in that room one day, Edna suffered the indignity of a robber went through the window and stole her handbag. These things are not normally spoken about, and I'm aware, I don't know, but I think the time that has come to tell the story. Speaking about time. Yes. Speaking about time, the time has come to tell the story. I'm not keeping you long, but I'm mentioning the story for a reason. That where we are is symbolic of the root that we have come from. And to honor that root, to match that spirit of service, is something basically that is always a challenge. And so while we talk to each other, let us also inspire each other to act in that spirit of service, as has been the legacy of all who are here. We need to somehow find a way to, because the issue of the people being dispirited is always before us. And so all of us who continue in that service, Christian service, civic service, let us, remembering where we have come from, build upon that. I just want that to be our last word as I welcome you to Drumblair, to regardless. Edna named it regardless because she felt regardless of what happened in life, carry on. This is where we are at. Strength and power to you all. Please enjoy our refreshments at the back. Thank you so much for coming. Is there anything I forgot?
Yeah, how are they going to get back?
Oh, very good. Very good. Always a pragmatician. So there is a walkway, and I think it is lit. If not, we have to turn on the lights. And you can go around the back. We'll turn on the lights around the back now. And there are refreshments waiting for you. So we welcome you to continue the conversation, to continue the fellowship, to refresh yourselves. And we hope to see you at the next conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We just want to remind you that Al Jazeera Plus may want to speak to some of you.
Thank you.
And David Batts doesn't have personal security here, so you can always attack him. You have my permission.
Eternal Father, bless our land. Guide us with thy mighty hand. Keep us free from evil powers. Be our light through countless hours. To our leaders, great defenders, grant true wisdom from above. Justice fruit be ours forever. Jamaica, land we love. Jamaica, Jamaica.